Twisted Tales.
At just 24 years old, David never could have imagined that he'd find himself working at a Subway, crafting sandwiches day after day. Faced with mounting expenses and a slowdown in his online work due to the epidemic, David couldn't turn down the chance to work 17 hours a week at Subway. The first few days were quiet, with each shift blending into the next as he repeated the same tasks over and over. Each day, David started by opening the store and preparing the breakfast meals. Next came baking the bread, followed by a brief break. But soon after, the lunch rush would hit, keeping him busy and on his feet. He carefully assembled each sandwich, layering slices of meat, fresh vegetables, cheese, and a sprinkle of spices with practiced precision. David's manager, Maggie, was young and full of energy, having just recently graduated. She loved her job, showing up every day with enthusiasm and an active, hands-on approach to her work. Unlike Maggie, David didn't enjoy working at Subway. Still, he tried to remain professional, aiming to please the customers and avoid giving anyone a reason to embarrass him. Deep down, he despised the chaos, the noise, the shouting, and the constant demands for food. For David, it was all about getting through the shift, completing orders as quickly as possible. He didn't care who walked through the door and never bothered to remember the faces of the customers he served. On a day he would never forget, a man walked into the store, someone unlike any customer David had ever seen. David remembered him clearly, a towering figure with a muscular build, standing about 6 feet 4 or 5 inches tall, and appearing to be in his 30s. The sight of him filled David with unease, especially since he felt so much smaller and weaker in comparison. The man started making his way toward the counter where David stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. David couldn't help but feel a wave of anxiety creep over him. Nervously, David asked him, his voice tinged with fear, "How? How can I help you?" The man opened a can of beer and began drinking. But his expression quickly turned uneasy. He took another sip, then started spitting the beer back into the can. A sight that was nothing short of revolting. Finally, he turned his gaze toward David and spoke.
Can you help me place a special order for me?
Of course I can.
He set the beer can on the counter, then slowly turned his gaze toward David. He ordered a large meat sandwich loaded with hot sauce. "No vegetables," he demanded, "except onions." Then he insisted David add every type of cheese available. David prepared the sandwich without a word, his hands moving mechanically. As David assembled the order, he couldn't help but think, this was the most revolting sandwich he'd ever made.
Hey, excuse me, can you add more ketchup?
Of course. Do you need something else?
If possible, can you also write your number on the napkins?
Sorry, I can't because I'm engaged.
What's his name?
His name is William.
He's lucky, this guy, William. I wish I could marry a woman like you before I get old.
Strangely, Maggie's smile remained unwavering, her expression calm and composed as she handed the sandwich to the unsettling customer. David froze, fear gripping him, but Maggie's calm nod urged him to focus. Together, they quickly processed the payment, eager to send the unsettling customer on his way. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and he didn't leave the store. He sat at the table and began eating with an almost feral intensity, sauce and bits of food scattering around him. It was as though he hadn't eaten in days, or was savoring his last meal on Earth. Maggie stared at David, urging calm, when a sudden disturbing noise broke the silence. The man approached the counter, clutching the payment check, his voice rising in anger as he yelled, "What kind of scam is this?" Maggie's smile faded as she looked at the customer and said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. What seems to be the issue? The man snapped angrily. You expect me to pay $40 for one sandwich? This is ridiculous, an outright scam. Her voice wavered as she explained to the angry customer, this is the price for the extras you requested. The man snapped back, all I asked for was spices and ketchup. Sensing Maggie's unease, David stepped in. Let's not forget that you also requested extra meat on your order, he interjected, hoping to defuse the tension. The customer turned on David, his voice rising. Don't interfere, and demanded that he wants to speak with the manager. Maggie straightened her posture, summoning her composure. I'm the manager, she said firmly. The man sneered, his disbelief evident. How can they give this position to someone as young as you? Without missing a beat, Maggie replied, her tone steely. That's the owner's decision, and it's none of your business. The man glared at Maggie with an aggressive intensity, his voice sharp and accusing. You're a scammer, he snarled. You tack on a bunch of crazy charges and pocket the difference. Maggie's confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of fear and uncertainty. David, standing nearby, felt a strong urge to intervene, but hesitated. Maggie was the manager. Was it his place to step in? While David wrestled with his thoughts, the man's voice grew louder, booming through the space as he waved his hand furiously. Get me the real manager, he demanded. Maggie held her ground, her voice trembling but firm. I told you, she said. I am the manager. In a flash, the man's hand lashed out, striking Maggie across the face. The impact caused her to stumble, nearly losing her balance. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek as tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't just hurt. She looked utterly confused, as though she couldn't quite process what had just happened. The man leaned in close, his voice a sinister tone. Don't ever lie to me. David surprised himself as the words burst out of his mouth. That's enough, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. I'm calling the police. The man turned to him with a menacing glare. His voice was low but charged with threat. Go ahead and call them, he said, but get ready to be squashed by me. The man turned abruptly, his fury boiling over as he knocked over one of the tables, sending it crashing to the floor. You're all a bunch of scam artists, he shouted, his voice echoing through the restaurant. Maggie, her voice trembling, turned to David. We need to call the police immediately, she urged. But before either of them could act, the man vaulted over the counter in a burst of rage. Grabbing Maggie, who screamed for help, David, driven by instinct, rushed to her aid, only to be met with a brutal punch that sent him staggering backward. Pain exploded in his face as blood trickled from his nose, leaving him momentarily stunned. David reflexively took a fighting stance. The movement caught the man's attention, and he turned toward David. The man sneered, What are you trying to do? Daring David to make a move, David felt a wave of intimidation wash over him. The man's towering presence was overwhelming. Before he could react further, the man suddenly rushed at him with startling speed. In one fluid motion, the man grabbed David and effortlessly hoisted him into the air, showcasing his immense strength. David struggled, his feet dangling helplessly, while Maggie watched the horrifying scene unfold from behind the counter. Her expression frozen in a mix of shock and fear. Unable to look away from the terrifying display of dominance, the man's grip tightened around David's neck as he hoisted him high, choking him while hurling insults with venomous rage. David struggled to breathe. His hand instinctively reached into his pocket, finding the small knife he carried. With a surge of self-preservation, David plunged the blade into the man's neck. The man collapsed to the floor, his crimson lifeblood pooling beneath him as he crawled weakly, his strength fading. David dropped to the ground, gasping for air and clutching his neck in pain. Maggie's piercing screams sounded through the place as she stared in horror at the man sprawled on the ground, surrounded by blood. Moments later, The sound of sirens filled the air as an ambulance and police cars arrived at the scene. The paramedics rushed into the store and quickly assessed the injured man lying on the floor. A police officer approached David and Maggie and took their statements. Maggie, overwhelmed and visibly shaken, as David tried to console her while recounting the chaotic events. "It looks like a case of self-defense," the officer said firmly, "but we'll need you to come down to the station to provide a full statement." The man survived the ordeal after receiving treatment, and David was cleared of all charges as his actions were deemed self-defense. Later, he learned that the man he fought is Adam Culver, who had a long history of violence and harassment, making him a dangerous psycho. David felt uneasy and quit his job at Subway. As he read the newspaper, he couldn't shake the fear. Would he ever feel safe again, knowing a psycho like Culver might come after him one day?